The night he told me he couldn't resist anymore, the city outside my window was a trembling constellation of headlights and half-remembered promises. I remember the hum of the car engine before anything else. A low, rhythmic confession that spoke in the spaces between our breaths. It was raining, not heavily, just enough to turn the streetlights into soft halos, blurring the line between reflection and reality. His hands gripped the steering wheel the way a man holds onto restraint, steady on the surface, trembling underneath. I should have said no. I should have pulled away. But there are moments that don't belong to logic, moments that grow like wild vines in the dark, climbing past everything you thought you believed about yourself. When he looked at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes caught mine, and for a heartbeat, the world stood still, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own pulse, of the heat beneath your skin, of the dangerous comfort in being seen. He said he couldn't resist anymore, and the truth was, neither could I. The words lingered between us, not like a question, but a surrender. Before I tell you what came after, my heart sank when I realized almost 90% of you watch these stories but never subscribe. If this one makes you feel something, that ache, that breath you didn't mean to hold, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It keeps stories like this alive, and it tells me you're still here, listening in the dark. Because if stories are sins, this one began with silence and the sound of rain tapping gently on a car roof. It started with nothing more than an exchange of glances, a brief, almost forgettable moment that somehow carved its place in memory. He was just a driver then, one of the many faces that passed through the narrow windows of my day. His name was Daniel, though it took me weeks to learn it. I first noticed his silence, the way it filled the car not awkwardly, but like a song I didn't yet know the words to. He drove through the city with a patience that didn't belong there, as if the world outside could rush all it wanted and he would still move at the pace of his own pulse. There was something steady about him, something that suggested he had seen too much to be hurried. I told myself that was why I kept requesting him, why I memorized his license plate without meaning to. I told myself it was habit, convenience. But even then, I think I knew I was lying. The city at night has its own kind of truth. The glow of neon over wet asphalt, the blur of strangers crossing under streetlights, the hollow rhythm of tires against the road. It all becomes a kind of confession booth. That night, I remember the air was thick with the scent of rain and exhaust. I sat in the back seat, watching the droplets race down the window, pretending I wasn't aware of his eyes catching mine in the mirror every few seconds. It wasn't a look of longing, not yet. It was curiosity edged with restraint. The kind of look that makes you wonder how much someone already sees without you saying anything. I was married then. My husband's world was one of polished surfaces and perfect timing. He loved me the way one loves a possession, with care but not curiosity. We were in elegant silence, our home filled with polite laughter and measured words. But Daniel's silence was different. His quiet felt alive, textured. When he spoke, rarely, his voice carried something that unsettled me. Not roughness, but truth unpolished. I found myself asking him questions I didn't need answers to, just to hear the way he spoke them. Each ride became a small ritual. The same corner, the same time, the same low hum of the engine beneath our words. Sometimes we spoke about nothing. The traffic, the rain, a song playing faintly on the radio. Other times there were pauses long enough to say everything we couldn't. I began to anticipate those pauses more than the words themselves. I told myself it was harmless, that it was only attention, that I was only human and he was only kind. But desire is never just kindness that overstays its welcome. It grows quietly, in the space where you stop pretending not to notice. There was a moment, one I replay more often than I should, when his hand brushed mine as I handed him cash. It wasn't deliberate, but the air shifted instantly. Something invisible cracked. I laughed to cover it, and he smiled, but his eyes betrayed him. That flicker of awareness that once seen can never be unseen. After that, the space between us was no longer neutral. Every word carried a pulse. Every glance felt like a question neither of us could safely answer. One evening, as the city folded into dusk, he asked if I was happy. Just that. No context, no preface. The kind of question you can't answer truthfully without unraveling something sacred. I stared at his reflection in the mirror and said yes. But the silence that followed was louder than any confession. I knew he didn't believe me. And worse, I knew he shouldn't. The rides stretched longer after that. Sometimes I'd ask him to take the long way home, pretending I wanted to avoid traffic. In truth, I wanted to delay the moment the world would expect me to step back into the life that no longer fit. There was safety in the car, a fragile bubble of anonymity. I could exist there without being anyone's wife, anyone's daughter, anyone's definition, just a woman breathing in the company of someone who saw her as she was, not as she should be. But safety is a fragile illusion. One night, as he helped me out of the car, his hand lingered a second too long. That second stretched into eternity, heavy with everything unsaid. My heart stuttered, my breath caught, and for a fleeting, treacherous instant, I didn't want to pull away. The street around us hummed with life, horns, footsteps, laughter. Yet all I could hear was the quiet drum of my own pulse. He looked at me then, directly, with an intensity that stripped the air bare. I saw the question in his eyes and the warning. I saw my reflection in both. I walked away, pretending not to feel his gaze following me, pretending not to ache from the weight of what hadn't happened yet. But as the door closed behind me and I stood in the hollow glow of my hallway, I realized something terrifying. The betrayal had already begun. Not in action, but in desire, and desire, once acknowledged, is a promise waiting to be broken. The next morning, I woke with his silence still lodged beneath my skin, like the echo of a song I couldn't stop hearing. I made coffee, smiled at my husband, went through the motions of a life that suddenly felt borrowed. But when I stepped outside and smelled the faint trace of rain on the pavement, all I could think of was Daniel, and how easily stillness can become hunger. And somewhere in that hunger, something in me had already decided that one day, I would stop pretending to resist. The next time I saw Daniel, the air between us carried a different gravity, something unspoken, but heavy enough to tilt the world slightly off its axis. The city moved as it always did, indifferent and alive, but inside the car, the rhythm had changed. He greeted me the same way he always did, his tone polite, his eyes careful. Yet beneath that care was awareness, a shared secret neither of us dared to name. I remember sitting there, pretending to check my phone, my reflection trembling faintly against the glass. I could feel his gaze in the mirror, not constant, not intrusive, but present, like a steady hand resting just above the surface of my skin. It wasn't lust, not yet. It was something slower, deeper, more dangerous. It was understanding. That's the thing about forbidden desire. It doesn't announce itself with fire. It begins with warmth, subtle and almost innocent. A kindness extended one too many times. A glance held 1 second too long. Every small gesture gathers meaning until you can no longer tell which part was the beginning and which part was simply you, unraveling. Daniel asked how my week had been, and I heard the question for what it truly was. Not curiosity about my errands or appointments, but about my heart. I told him it had been busy, and he smiled, as though he could see through the lie without needing to challenge it. His smile was the kind that carried restraint, the kind of quiet dignity born from someone who has had to master patience as survival. There was depth in it, a quiet ache that drew me closer, even when I tried to look away. I wanted to ask about him, about where he went after his shift, who waited for him, what dreams he had before he began driving strangers through the dark. But I didn't. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know him, or just the version of him that existed only for me, the man behind the wheel, the silence between destinations. Each evening blurred into the next, a series of excuses dressed as errands. My husband began to notice, asking where I went so often, why I preferred rides instead of driving myself. I told him I was tired of traffic, that I liked the time to think. And it wasn't entirely a lie, I did think. About Daniel. About the strange familiarity that tethered me to him. About how easily I had become a stranger in my own life. There were moments when I caught Daniel watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. His eyes were not bold, but observant, studying, not claiming. That restraint made it worse. It made me want to be the reason he lost it. I found myself dressing differently without admitting why. A softer blouse, a trace of perfume I hadn't worn in years. I told myself it was for me, but even lies can sound beautiful when whispered softly enough. One evening, after a particularly long silence, he said, "You seem lonely." The words weren't cruel or invasive. They were simple, tender, almost apologetic. My throat tightened. I wanted to say no, to defend myself, to remind him that I had a husband, a home, a life full of noise. But instead, the truth slipped out. Not in words, but in the way I didn't answer. Silence can be its own confession. He nodded once, as though he understood more than I wanted him to, and turned his eyes back to the road. After that, our conversations changed. He began to ask about small things. What I liked to read, whether I preferred the ocean or the mountains, if I believed people could be meant for each other in ways that didn't fit inside the rules. His questions were never prying, but they lingered. I started thinking about them long after the rides ended, replaying the timbre of his voice, the way he paused after certain words, like he was measuring the distance between caution and desire. The truth is, I began to crave his company in ways that startled me. Not his touch, and not yet, but his presence. The quiet steadiness of him. In a world that demanded constant performance, Daniel became the one space where I could be unguarded, where my silence didn't need translation. He made me feel visible, not in the way people watch, but in the way they see. And once you've been seen like that, returning to invisibility feels unbearable. One night, as the rain drummed gently against the windshield, he told me about his childhood in Lagos. The noise, the color, the music that spilled from every corner. His voice softened when he spoke of his mother, how she used to hum when she cooked. I listened, not because the story was remarkable, but because it was his. When he looked at me then, I saw the same hunger reflected, not just for touch, but for understanding. For someone who would hear the truth and not flinch. The city lights flickered across his face, casting him in fragments, part shadow, part flame. My heart ached in ways that defied reason. I wanted to say something, to bridge the impossible distance between us. But all I managed was his name. He turned just slightly, enough for our eyes to meet through the mirror. That look, quiet, heavy, unrelenting, felt like the moment before a storm breaks. I stepped out of the car that night trembling, my pulse caught between guilt and longing. I knew what I was standing on, the fragile edge between fantasy and ruin. But as his taillights faded into the dark, I realized something terrifying. The weight of his eyes had followed me home, and no matter how tightly I closed mine, I couldn't make them disappear. That was the night I stopped lying to myself. Whatever this was, whatever we were becoming, it had already begun to change everything. And somewhere deep inside, I think I wanted it to. It happened slowly, like dusk bleeding into night. There wasn't a single moment I could point to, no sudden crossing of a line, just a series of quiet surrenders that accumulated until resistance no longer meant anything. Desire is rarely loud in its beginnings. It creeps in, patient and steady, until it is part of your every thought. I remember that evening clearly, the way one remembers the last calm breath before diving underwater. The city was damp from rain, the air sweet and metallic. I had left a dinner halfway through, unable to sit another minute in the noise of half-truths and polite laughter. I ordered a ride before I even knew where I wanted to go. When Daniel's car pulled up, I felt that same tug in my chest, a gravity that both frightened and steadied me. He didn't ask why I was out so late, or why my eyes were already tired. He simply nodded, started the engine, and let the city slip by us like a slow confession. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was full of everything we hadn't yet said, Everything we already knew. The glow from the dashboard washed his face in soft gold, and I found myself watching him, tracing the shape of his jaw, the way the muscles moved when he clenched his teeth. He must have felt my gaze because he looked at me through the mirror, and for a long moment, neither of us looked away. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" I asked quietly. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed someone to hear the question I'd never dared to voice. He hesitated before answering. "Every day," he said. "But then sometimes someone sits in my car, and for a while, it feels real again." The words landed between us like a promise. I turned my face toward the window, but the reflection staring back at me wasn't the woman I thought I was. There was a stranger there, one who wanted, one who was done pretending not to. The city outside blurred into a smear of light, like a world losing focus. Inside the car, everything sharpened. When the rain started again, it came soft and steady, drumming against the roof in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. He parked beneath an awning at the edge of an empty street, the kind where time seemed to pause. I could hear the faint sound of our breathing, uneven but in sync. He didn't turn around. Neither did I. The tension wasn't sharp anymore. It had softened into inevitability. I could feel the heat of his presence even through the space between us. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered, though my body betrayed me by leaning forward. "I know," he said. And yet, he didn't move either. The next few seconds stretched into eternity, the kind of moment you feel rather than measure. He turned then, slowly, and our eyes met not through the mirror, but directly, unguarded. There was no rush, no wildness, just a deep, aching quiet that felt like the truth. He reached for my hand, not as a thief takes, but as someone asking permission. My fingers met his halfway, trembling. Everything after that was silence, the kind that speaks in breaths and heartbeats. His skin was warm, his touch both hesitant and sure. The world outside dissolved. No rules, no promises, no future. Just two people suspended in the narrow space between desire and regret. When he leaned closer, I could smell the faint trace of rain on his collar, the salt of his skin. Our lips met softly at first, almost reverent, as if both of us feared what would come after. Then it deepened, inevitable, a quiet implosion of everything we had been holding back. For a moment, time stopped existing. There was no husband, no home, no world beyond the car's fogged windows. Only heat, breath, and the unbearable tenderness of being known. I remember the way his hand rested against the side of my face, the way his thumb brushed my jaw as if memorizing it. I remember the sound of rain, the rhythm of it syncing with the quickening of my pulse. And I remember the silence afterward, that heavy, echoing stillness that follows the breaking of something sacred. We didn't speak. We couldn't. He started the engine again, driving without direction, as if motion could erase what had just happened. But the air between us had changed irrevocably. I could taste him still, the warmth of him, the weight of everything that could never be undone. My heart felt too loud, too alive, as if it had been asleep until that very moment. When he finally stopped, I didn't want to leave. I sat there, staring at the rain streaking down the windshield, feeling the quiet ache of something both beautiful and catastrophic. He turned to me, eyes heavy with everything he didn't say. "I couldn't resist anymore," he said softly. The words were not justification, not apology, just truth. Neither could I. I stepped out of the car into the rain, the world cool against my flushed skin. My legs trembled, but not from cold. I didn't look back, though I felt his gaze following me until I disappeared into the blur of the streetlights. The night closed around me like a secret. I walked home drenched, but untouched by the water, burning instead with the knowledge that I had crossed a line that no rain could wash away. When I reached my door, I paused. The key felt heavy in my hand. Inside was the life I had promised to keep, the one that had never asked for this betrayal. Yet, as I stepped across the threshold, the silence felt different now. Hollow, distant, like a room that no longer belonged to me. I told myself it would end there, that it had been a moment, a mistake. But desire doesn't end with the act. It lingers, seeps into your bones, reshapes your reflection. And when I closed my eyes that night, I still felt the ghost of his hand against my skin, and knew that this was only the beginning of the undoing. Morning light has a cruelty that night never does. It doesn't forgive and it doesn't lie. It spills across every surface, illuminating the things we try to keep hidden. That morning the sun rose like judgment. My reflection in the mirror was pale and unfamiliar, my eyes ringed with the weight of what I'd done. The city outside my window was waking, stretching, living as if nothing had shifted, but inside me everything had tilted off its axis. I sat at the edge of my bed, the sound of my husband's voice drifting faintly from the kitchen, and for a long moment, I could not remember how to breathe like I used to. He was humming softly, the same tune he always hummed when he made coffee. That small normalcy felt unbearable. Every gesture of his kindness was an accusation I couldn't meet. I went through the morning like someone walking underwater, slow, heavy, disconnected. He asked if I had slept well, and I said yes. He smiled, handed me a cup, and kissed my forehead with the easy affection of a man who trusted me completely. The warmth of the cup burned my palms, but I didn't let go. Guilt, I discovered, doesn't come all at once. It arrives in waves, small, relentless, rising quietly until you are drowning without realizing when it began. When I stepped outside, the city felt sharper than usual. Every sound, car horns, footsteps, snippets of conversation, seemed to echo louder, clearer, as though the world was conspiring to remind me that I didn't belong to its innocence anymore. I told myself I wouldn't see Daniel again, that it had been one night stolen from reason, one lapse that could be buried beneath routine. But even as I thought it, I felt the truth pressing against my ribs. Once you've tasted freedom from your own mask, it's almost impossible to wear it again. Days passed in careful repetition. I filled them with work, with errands, with the noise of anything that could distract me. But guilt is a stubborn ghost. It followed me through the hallways of my office, through the polite dinners, through the quiet moments before sleep. Sometimes I would close my eyes and see the faint glow of the dashboard light across his face. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night, my chest tight, my body remembering before my mind did. And every morning I would stand in the mirror and promise myself I was done. Then one afternoon, I saw him. Not by plan, at least not consciously. I was walking out of a store when I caught sight of him across the street, leaning against his car, head bowed slightly, as if in prayer. My heart stumbled. He looked up, and in that brief exchange, the entire world narrowed again to just the two of us. I could have walked away. I should have. But my feet betrayed me, carrying me forward before my mind could protest. He didn't speak when I reached him. He just opened the car door, and for a moment we stood in silence. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, not physical, but the kind that comes from carrying too many unspoken things. I wanted to tell him I was sorry. I wanted to say that what happened was wrong, that I had a life I couldn't destroy. But the words felt useless. Sorry doesn't erase the truth. It only exposes it. I told myself I wouldn't see you again, I said finally. He nodded, his voice quiet. I told myself the same thing. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. The space between us was charged with the memory of what we'd already crossed. But beneath that tension, there was something softer. Grief, maybe. A shared awareness that we were standing inside a story that could only end in loss. I thought of my husband, of the promises I'd made, of the version of myself that had existed before Daniel's eyes had ever found me. And for the first time, I realized how impossible it would be to go back to her. The following weeks blurred together, a strange limbo of distance and memory. We didn't speak. I tried to return to my routine, to be the woman I was supposed to be. But the silence between Daniel and me had a gravity of its own. It pulled at me in unexpected moments. I'd catch myself looking for his car in traffic, listening for his voice in crowds. It wasn't just longing. It was guilt, hunger, confusion all tangled together until I could no longer tell which part of it was mine. Rumors began to ripple through my circle, small, harmless-seeming questions about why I seemed distracted, where I went after work, who I was texting with such intent. People notice more than they say. My husband asked one evening if I was happy. His tone was gentle, almost weary, but his eyes searched me with quiet suspicion. I told him yes, of course. But even as I said it, I could feel something inside him withdraw, the first crack in a trust that had been unshakable. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. I wanted to confess everything, to spill the truth just to stop the ache of holding it. But I knew that confession doesn't heal. It destroys. So I stayed silent, watching the faint light move across the ceiling, feeling the slow unraveling of two lives that had once fit neatly together. By the time dawn came again, I understood that love and betrayal can coexist in the same heart, that guilt can be both punishment and comfort. Daniel and I had crossed something irreversible, but the true consequence was not in being discovered. It was in knowing. Once you have tasted the kind of connection that defies the life you've built, you can never unknow it. And though I told myself it was over, deep down I sensed the truth waiting like a storm at the edge of the horizon, because some silences don't fade. They return, louder, heavier, demanding to be answered. Time has a way of turning even the sharpest memories into something smooth, almost bearable. But there are some things it cannot dull. The sound of a voice that once said your name a certain way. The look that made you forget who you were supposed to be. In the weeks that followed, silence became my only language. Daniel and I had stopped speaking, but absence has its own kind of conversation. I felt him in every empty moment, in every glance that lingered a second too long on the rearview mirrors of passing cars. The city went on as always, restless, unbothered, yet I moved through it like a shadow of myself, haunted by the echo of something I could neither claim nor forget. My husband began to sense the change, though he couldn't name it. He became gentler, more attentive, as if trying to reach for something that had already slipped beyond his grasp. Every kindness from him was a blade that cut deeper. I'd smile, I'd play the part, but underneath I was unraveling. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was grief. Grief for what I had broken, and for what I could never have. Nights stretched long and quiet, the space between us in bed wide enough to fit every unsaid truth. I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if Daniel was awake too, wondering if he thought of me or if he had learned to forget. He didn't call, and neither did I. But once, as I crossed the street near the market, I saw him parked at a distance. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was somewhere else, lost, tired. For a heartbeat, I considered walking over, breaking the silence that had grown thick around us. But I didn't. There are moments when love becomes cruelty, not in action, but in persistence. To speak would have been to open the wound again. So I turned away, carrying the ache like a hidden flame. As weeks became months, life began to rebuild itself around the hollow places. My husband started traveling more, perhaps out of trust, perhaps to escape the quiet tension that had settled between us. I began to write again, letters I never sent, words I didn't speak aloud. Sometimes I would drive through the streets alone, tracing the routes Daniel and I once took together, letting the city swallow me whole. The smell of rain still carried him. Certain songs became unbearable. Even silence became a reminder. It's strange how the world doesn't stop for heartbreak. Bills still arrive. Seasons still change. People still laugh in restaurants, kiss at red lights, make promises they believe they'll keep. Life insists on continuing, indifferent to the ruins it leaves behind. I tried to follow its rhythm, but something in me had shifted permanently. I had glimpsed a version of myself that existed outside duty, outside expectation. And though she had cost me everything, I couldn't forget her. There came a night when I finally told my husband the truth. Not all of it, not Daniel's name, not the details, but enough. We were sitting in the dark, the space between us filled with the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of our breathing. My voice shook, but I spoke. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was only silence, a vast, aching quiet that felt heavier than anger. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "I don't know what hurts more," he said, "that you did it, or that I didn't see you slipping away." That was the last night we shared a bed. The next morning he left early, leaving a note on the table. No accusations, just finality. The house felt enormous after that, every sound echoing off the walls like a memory of laughter that no longer belonged there. I thought I would cry, but I didn't. The tears had already been spent, long before the truth ever reached daylight. Daniel called once, weeks later. I let it ring. Not out of anger, but because I knew that hearing his voice would pull me back into the same orbit I had barely escaped. Love, when twisted by guilt, stops being sanctuary and becomes a kind of prison. I couldn't go back and I couldn't undo it. All that was left was to learn to live with the silence, the kind that doesn't fade but changes shape, becoming something almost tender with time. Years later, I still think of him sometimes. Not with longing, not with regret, but with the quiet acceptance that some people enter your life not to stay, but to show you the edges of your own heart. He was the echo that reminded me I was still alive, even as everything else in me was fading. Sometimes, in the soft hum of evening traffic, I imagine his car passing by again, not to stop, but to remind me that we existed once, in that narrow space between what we wanted and what we could keep. And though the world will never know our story, I carry it still. Not as shame, not as romance, but as truth. Raw, imperfect, and irrevocable. The kind of truth that whispers in the quiet moments when the world is asleep, asking no forgiveness, seeking no absolution. Only remembrance. The silence that follows love is never empty.